There's a skill that separates good leaders from truly great ones. It has nothing to do with charisma, titles, or how loud you speak in a meeting. It's the ability to read what's actually happening in a room. The energy underneath the words, the tension nobody's naming out loud. Carl Jung spent his entire career mapping exactly that territory. Not boardroom specifically, but the hidden architecture of human behavior. Born in Switzerland in 1875, Jung became the most ambitious cartographer of the human psyche who ever lived. His method still works today. In 1907, he met Sigmund Freud in Vienna. They talked for 13 hours straight without stopping. That tells you something about Jung's intensity. Eventually, Jung broke from Freud entirely. He believed human behavior ran far deeper than Freud's theories could reach. So he built his own framework. That framework is what makes him so useful for leaders. Because Jung wasn't just studying patients. He was studying every person in every room. His core insight was simple but staggering. Most of what drives human behavior happens beneath conscious awareness. People don't always know why they react the way they do. Jung called this the unconscious, and he argued it speaks constantly through body language, silence, emotional reactions, and the energy someone carries into a space. Think about the last meeting you walked into. Someone was quiet, who's usually talkative. Someone laughed a little too quickly at a colleague's idea. Most leaders push through those signals. Jung would say, stopping there is exactly where the real leadership begins. The room is always telling you something. Jung identified 4 core psychological functions that every person uses to process the world: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Each person leads with one. The thinker in your room wants logic and structure. The feeler wants to know the human impact. Miss that distinction, and you'll lose half the room before you start. Then there's the shadow, Jung's term for the parts of ourselves we don't acknowledge. In a room, shadow shows up as defensiveness, dismissiveness, or sudden silence. When someone shuts down a new idea fast, that's rarely about the idea. Jung would say, look at what that reaction is protecting. That's where the real conversation lives. One leader noticed a colleague always kept their camera off during calls, giving short-clipped answers. The assumption was disengagement. The reality was completely different. One simple question changed everything. How are you today on a scale of 1 to 10? The colleague opened up. They were working from a crowded family space, embarrassed. That's Jungian leadership in practice. You stop projecting your interpretation onto someone else's behavior. You get curious about what's actually underneath it. Jung wrote that the relationship between the conscious and unconscious is compensatory. What someone shows you on the surface is always balancing something they're not showing you. Reading a room means learning to see both layers simultaneously. What's being said and what's being carried. Most people only track one of those. Jung also warned against assuming silence means the same thing everywhere. In one culture, it signals disagreement. In another, it signals deep respect. Context is everything. The goal isn't to psychoanalyze everyone you meet. It's to stay genuinely curious rather than reactive. That single shift changes how a room responds to you. This deep understanding, honed over 86 years, is what allows certain leaders to sense subtle shifts and steer conversations with profound insight. Jung also developed something he called individuation. It's the lifelong process of integrating who you actually are with who you've been pretending to be. For leaders, that process matters enormously. The parts of yourself you haven't examined are the parts most likely to damage a room without warning. Jung invented word association at Bergholzli Hospital in Zurich. He'd say a word. Measure the pause before someone responded. The hesitation told him everything. That pause is still happening in your meetings. Someone takes a beat too long before answering. That gap is data, not dead air. Jung called those charged pauses complexes. Emotional knots tied around a specific topic or memory. They hijack responses before the conscious mind catches up. Every team has them. The budget conversation that always gets tense. The project name nobody wants to revisit. Those aren't coincidences. They're complexes in action. The leader who recognizes a complex doesn't bulldoze through it. They slow down, name the tension gently, and let the room breathe before moving forward. Jung also believed every person carries both introverted and extroverted tendencies. The one they lead with shapes how they process information under pressure. An extrovert processes out loud. They need to talk through an idea to understand it. Silence them in a meeting and you've cut off their thinking entirely. An introvert processes internally first. Push them for an immediate answer and you'll get a surface response, not their actual best thinking. The best leaders build space for both. They ask the question, then pause. That pause isn't awkward. It's an invitation for the room's full intelligence to show up. Jung wrote that anyone who wants to understand the human psyche should wander through the world with an open heart rather than rely on textbooks alone. That's not a metaphor for wandering aimlessly. It's a directive to stay present with actual people rather than your assumptions about them. People remember how a leader made them feel far longer than anything written on a slide. Jung understood that decades before anyone called it emotional intelligence. His concept of the self, the organizing center of the whole psyche, suggests every person is working toward coherence. They want to make sense of their own experience. When a leader helps someone feel understood, they're actually supporting that process. That's why genuine listening lands so differently than performative listening. There's a workshop story worth knowing. A facilitator noticed someone laugh off a colleague's idea. The rest of the room went quiet and uncomfortable immediately. The facilitator named it, not accusingly, just plainly. That single acknowledgement unlocked a conversation the team had been avoiding for months. That's the move. Not analysis, not confrontation, just naming what the room is already feeling. Jung called it making the unconscious conscious. It takes practice. Your first instinct is to keep the agenda moving. The Jungian instinct is to treat the disruption as the most important item on that agenda. Jung's methodology was never about fixed rules. He called himself an empiricist. He observed first, theorized second, and stayed genuinely open to being wrong. That posture is available to any leader right now. Walk in curious. Watch before you speak. Let what's actually in the room inform what you do next. The room is always running ahead of the agenda. The leaders who follow it rather than fight it are the ones people actually want to follow back. Jung's work eventually gave leaders something most training programs never do. A way to understand their own blind spots before those blind spots cost them a room. He identified something called the persona, the professional mask every person wears. The problem isn't wearing one. The problem is forgetting you have it on. When a leader confuses their persona with their actual self, they stop adapting. They perform authority instead of exercising it. The room feels that difference immediately. Jung noticed this pattern in patients who held high-status roles. The more defended the mask, the more isolated the person behind it became over time. The antidote isn't vulnerability as performance. It's what Jung called psychological honesty. Knowing which parts of your reaction belong to the situation and which belong to you. His dream analysis work revealed something directly applicable here. Every symbol in a dream has both a personal meaning and a universal one. People in rooms work the same way. The colleague who always pushes back in meetings isn't just being difficult. They may be carrying something universal, a need to be heard that predates your organization entirely. Jung's concept of archetypes explains why certain leadership dynamics repeat across completely different teams and industries. The patterns aren't coincidental. They're structural. The hero archetype shows up as the leader who needs to rescue every situation personally. The sage shows up as the one who withholds knowledge to maintain power. Recognizing which archetype is running in a room lets you respond to the actual dynamic rather than just the surface behavior. That's a different level of leadership entirely. Jung's 1944 heart attack changed his thinking permanently. During his near-death experience, he reported visions so specific, they reshaped how he understood the psyche's relationship with time. He came back from that experience convinced the unconscious isn't just reactive, it's prospective. It's already working on your future, while your conscious mind manages the present. For leaders, that idea is worth sitting with practically. The unease you feel before a decision isn't always anxiety. Sometimes it's information arriving ahead of the evidence. Jung called that perspective function the psyche's sense of direction. Learning to distinguish it from fear is one of the harder and more useful things a leader can develop. Active imagination was another tool Jung developed. You engage deliberately with an image or feeling rather than pushing it aside. Leaders can use this before high-stakes conversations. Spend 2 minutes before a difficult conversation asking what you're actually bringing into the room. Not the agenda, your emotional state, your assumptions, your unfinished history with this person. That preparation changes the conversation before it starts. You arrive less defended, which paradoxically makes you more effective. The room opens when the leader does. Jung wrote in his final years that the greatest danger facing humanity was unconsciousness. People acting from impulses they'd never examined, at scale, with real consequences. That warning applies directly to leadership. An unexamined leader doesn't just limit themselves. They shape the psychological environment of every person who works around them. The good news is the work is available to anyone. You don't need a therapist or a framework. You need the habit of asking one question after every significant interaction. What was I reacting to in there? Not what happened. What in you responded to what happened. That gap is where Jung spent his entire life working. The leaders who ask that question consistently become the ones who never lose a room twice the same way. They learn. And the rooms they lead start to feel it. Jung's work didn't stop at reading other people. The deeper application was always turning that same attention back on yourself, the leader in the room. He wrote that the psyche has 4 antinomies, built-in paradoxes. The one most useful to leaders: a psychological statement is only true if its opposite can also be asserted. That means the colleague who frustrates you most is probably showing you something real about yourself. Jung called this projection. It's uncomfortable and extraordinarily useful. Projection works in reverse too. The qualities you most admire in someone else, often the ones you haven't yet claimed in yourself. That's not flattery. That's data. Jung's concept of the anima and animus matters here. Every person carries both masculine and feminine psychological energies. Suppressing either one costs you range as a leader. The leader who can only drive and never receive rarely builds real loyalty. The one who can only nurture and never decide loses the room's confidence entirely. Jung spent years studying alchemy not for mysticism, but for its psychological symbolism. The alchemist's goal of turning base metal into gold mapped directly onto human transformation. For leaders, that transformation is specific. You take raw conflict, unspoken tension, unresolved history, and through genuine engagement, you turn it into something the team can actually use. Jung described this as holding the tension of opposites, not resolving conflict prematurely, staying with the discomfort long enough for something genuinely new to emerge from it. Most leaders collapse that tension too fast. They smooth it over, call it resolved, and move on. The unresolved part resurfaces 3 meetings later, louder than before. Jung's final major work, Man and His Symbols, published in 1961, was written deliberately for people with no psychology background. He wanted this accessible. That was the point. He agreed to write it after a BBC interview in 1959 convinced him ordinary people were genuinely hungry for this material. He was 83 and still working. That book introduced archetypes to a generation of readers who'd never set foot in a therapist's office, leaders included. The ideas spread because they were immediately recognizable. Recognizable because archetypes aren't theories. They're patterns you've already lived. The moment you read them, you see them everywhere, in your team, your organization, your own history. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest colleague, spent her career translating his ideas into practical human terms. She said the unconscious always moves toward wholeness, even when it looks like chaos. That reframe changes how a leader reads a difficult team. The dysfunction isn't random. It's the group's unconscious trying to surface something that needs to be addressed. The question shifts from what's wrong with these people to what is this group trying to work out. That single reframe is worth more than most leadership courses combined. Jung believed the second half of life, roughly from 40 onward, was when the real psychological work began. External achievement gives way to internal integration. For leaders, that shift is visible. The ones who've done that work stop needing the room to validate them. They lead from something steadier than approval. Jung wrote that wholeness was never about being perfect. It was about being complete, knowing your full range, and choosing deliberately which part of yourself the moment requires. Every room you walk into is a psychological event. The people, the history, the unspoken stakes, all of it is live. Jung gave you the tools to read it. If this changed how you see a room, share it with someone who leads people. And subscribe, there's more of this kind of thinking coming your way.